Should I start now?
Yeah, please.
Okay. On May 13th, 1958, after 4 years of open warfare between France and the Algerian national movement known as the National Liberation Front, or FLN, the headquarters of the government general in Algiers was stormed by a massive crowd of Algerian settlers of European descent known as Pieds Noirs, while French security forces stood by and watched. In France, this event drove home the fecklessness of the Fourth Republic, and the government was deposed within weeks as Charles de Gaulle emerged from retirement to take control of France. Meanwhile, the Pieds Noirs had discovered that after 4 years in which their long-term survival had seemed in question, their power could be felt from Algiers to Paris. The Pieds Noirs had become convinced that no government which did not actively fight to preserve the status quo in Algeria could retain power in Paris. Within another 4 years, the confidence of the Pieds Noirs in both their own influence and in de Gaulle were shattered, as representatives of the FLN and the Fifth Republic negotiated the Evian Accords, in which France ceded sovereignty over Algeria to the FLN in March of 1962, and by the end of 1962, almost the entirety of the nearly 1.4 million Pieds Noirs population had fled to France. In that period of exaltation and abasement, however, a unique Pieds Noir identity took its final shape. In the seizure of the government general building in 1958, a curious exchange took place that symbolized and encapsulated the relationship between metropolitan France and the Pieds Noir community. In the foyer of the building was a statue of Marianne, the incarnation of the French Republic that was perhaps most famously portrayed in Eugène Delacroix's 1830 painting, Liberty Leading the People. The statue was destroyed as the crowd invaded the building. When Raoul Salan, the ranking French general in Algeria at the time of the uprising, arrived at the building and asked if there had been any casualties during the mob action, the reply was that there were none except Marianne, and she doesn't count. Clearly, this attitude did not reflect a close attachment to Paris or the French Republic. However, the entire rationale of the uprising was to demand that France retain possession and control of Algeria, which the Pieds Noirs believed that Paris was about to cede to popular sovereignty, which would effectively mean Arab and Berber dominance. It is in this light that this paper addresses the question of nationalism as it pertains to the Pieds Noirs. It makes the argument that an attenuated and fragile but still present form of nationalism existed in the Pieds Noirs community despite its embrace of France and the French army in particular in its moments of existential crisis. It further argues that this nationalist sentiment sustained the Pieds Noirs community as a cohesive and vital political and cultural force within but largely separate from the French nation. After examining the literature on the French settler community in Algeria and how existing theories of nationalism may apply to it, works and articles from contemporary journalists and writers such as Albert Camus, Alain de Sévigny, and Pierre Lafont are analyzed in support of these arguments. Finally, the relevance of Pieds Noir nationalism in the modern day are considered by looking at the activities of the Pieds Noir Party and Pieds Noir State in France, along with the issue of memorializing colonial activity and settler populations in Algeria. Feeling abandoned by successive French governments and misunderstood by the metropolitan French populace, a small but militant separatist movement arose among the colonists in the 1890s. Although recognizing that the French army was indispensable to them, this led to the development of a position called Algerianité, or a belief in the superiority of colonial and culture and advocacy for minimal or no metropolitan involvement in colonial affairs. While mainstream Algerianists desired the protective umbrella of the French armed forces and free access to French markets, along with complete local colonial control exercised by the Pieds Noirs, fully separatist movements continued to arise, such as the Latin unions of the 1920s and the National Assembly for Social Action of the late 1930s. On May 8, 1945, a riot in the coastal city of Sétif ignited a series of dueling atrocities that culminated in war between elements of the indigenous Arab and Berber populations and France in 1954. Under those circumstances, there were few calls for outright secession from France, given that, again, the Pied Noir community depended upon French military strength for its survival. However, it became intricately intertwined with the French army itself, as the army fixated on redeeming itself from the disasters of 1940 and the defeat in Indochina at Dien Bien Phu, also in 1954. As a result, instead of seeking secession from France, most Pied Noir leaders, along with some senior French government and military officials, decided that Algeria would dictate the policy of the French government itself for the benefit of Algeria, starting with the uprising of 1958, then forming the Secret Army Organization, or OAS, in January of 1961 for this purpose. The subsequent war against both the FLN and the French government waged by the OAS inflicted 3 times the number of casualties in the period from early 1961 to late 1962 than had the FLN between 1956 and 1962. There is a substantial literature documenting the cultural differences between the Pied Noir and even the Provençal and other Mediterranean French. Alistair Horn borrows a description given them by the French army, Mediterraneans and a half, to graphically demonstrate their passionate nature, their addiction to sun and surf, their relative indifference to death, and their easygoing existence. Horn also notes that even prior to the Algerian War of Independence, most Pied Noirs were not ethnically French, but rather Spanish and Italian. Amy Hubble relates that an important part of the Pied Noir identity is a powerful attachment to the land of Algeria related to their tenure there of more than a century, beginning in 1830. Hubble also points out that most Pied Noirs had never been to France before 1962, which contributed to their sense of difference from the metropolitan French both before and after their exile. An Algerian dialect arose from the influence on French of the Spanish, Italian, and Arab inhabitants. This dialect was called patois, which is widely believed to be the Menorcan approximation of the French word patois, although some hold that it comes from a French pejorative for Spanish migrants, potato eaters. While Camus was dismissive of the significance of patois, it figured prominently in the depiction of Cagaillou, a witty, streetwise Pied Noir character by an author with the nom de plume of Musette. It was through this brash but capable rogue, wildly popular in Algeria, that the image of the Pied Noir was transmitted to metropolitan France and globally. Samuel Kalman makes the argument that constant fear of the numerically superior Muslim indigène led settlers to radically define what constituted an Algerian against what an Algerian was not, primarily a Muslim, a Jew, or indeed to a large extent a metropolitan Frenchman who was derided as feckless and weak. The othering of non-Europeans, along with a fear of representative institutions as facilitating an indigène takeover and a belief in the superiority of a Pied Noir race, marked the most successful Algerian political parties as exemplars of colonial fascism. In the wake of the exodus of the Pied Noir to France, they and the French metropole uneasily worked their way toward accommodation. Song Un Choi relates the initial efforts of the French government to keep the colons in Algeria, or even to shunt them to South America. This seems like a shocking display of indifference, but beyond the expenditure of resources necessary to receive over 1 million people in a short amount of time, the French public had soured on the war and the Pied Noir, and as Christopher Hitchens points out, de Gaulle had never forgiven the colonists for submitting to the Vichy government in 1940. De Gaulle even uncharitably extended this lack of concern to the Harkis, or Arab soldiers who had worked with the French during the war, reasoning that they had betrayed their people just as had the Pied Noir. Claire Eldridge relates that, resigning itself to the inevitable, France assigned the new arrivals a new status as repatriates so they could easily enter the country and apply for benefits. While this provided a welcome respite for a mass of people who had lost everything, Hubble points out that the cost of accepting repatriate status was the loss of the recipient's Algerian identity in favor of a French one. Moreover, Hubble mentions that the repatriate assistance led to a condescension on the part of the metropolitan French toward the Pied Noir. In fact, it was in this period that the Algerian settlers first received the name Pied Noir, or Blackfoot, a pejorative intended to imply that life in Algeria had made them dirty. Finally, Eldridge says that the assistance was often insufficient to allow families to afford to live on their own, which forced them to overcrowd rental properties. This drew the further scorn of the metropolitan French. In response, many Pieds Noirs became politically involved, falling back on the metropolitan versions of parties with which they had been involved in Algeria, such as the far-right party, the National Front, whose leader, Jean-Marie Le Pen, had been active in the French Algeria Front and the OAS prior to the loss of Algeria and had regrouped in France. Le Pen attracted them with rhetoric tying Algérianité to the regeneration of the metropole, declaring the fight for l'Algérie française prepared the struggle for la France française. However, this has caused some generational strife as the children and grandchildren of the Algerian exile community attempt to move forward from the trauma of the Algerian War. The Pieds Noirs that had no interest in engaging in metropolitan politics worked to build associations to retain the memories of the life and culture of their prior community in Algeria. Coupled with cites organizations such as the Center for Historical Documentation about Algeria, the CDHA, which has tasked themselves with preserving the memory of a place and time which will obviously fade with time and the passing of those who are present. These organizations have not only kept the memory of l'Algérie française alive, but have provided material assistance to the Pieds Noirs community in France. The role of nationalism in the history of the Pieds Noirs is a complex question because throughout its history, the mainstream impulse of their community was to embrace France more closely, not to secede from it. However, as has been shown in Barclay and Collin, from 1860 onward, there existed a threat of separatism on the edge of Algerian colonial society. Moreover, Dumont states that the FAF contained partisans of secession even through the Algerian War, centered in the Département of Oran, and that these carried forward into the OAS. Benedict Anderson defines a nation as an imagined political community, and imagined as both limited and sovereign. The Pieds Noirs in Algeria was imagined in Anderson's sense of fictive kinship, supremely political and certainly a community. As mentioned before, though, the question of sovereignty is complicated in the case of the Pieds Noirs. Anthony Smith defines a nation as a named community residing in a perceived homeland and having common myths and a shared history, a distinct public culture, and common laws and customs for all members. Smith opposes this to an ethne, which is similar to a nation, but is defined as a named human community connected to a homeland, possessing common myths of ancestry, shared memories, one or more elements of shared culture, and a measure of solidarity, at least among the elites. In the case of the Pieds Noirs, the condition concerning residence in a perceived homeland is met if Smith's additional proviso is attended. A nation must reside in a perceived homeland of its own, at least for a long period of time, in order to constitute itself as a nation. The ideal of Algérianité provides the common myths and shared history, and the previous discussion of the Pieds Noirs character proves its distinct public culture and common laws and customs. With the loss of Algeria in 1962, the transition from nation to ethne may be well advanced, but it's hard to escape the conclusion that in 1962, the Pieds Noirs community met Smith's definition of a nation. The question of sovereignty remains, though. This paper will engage the existing scholarship by confronting the question of Pieds Noir nationalism directly, as opposed to the other sided cases that treat instances of the consideration of sovereignty as ephemeral and seem to uniformly assume that the Pieds Noir community fits squarely into Smith's model of the ethne. It will argue that Anderson's requirement at least the ambition of sovereignty was fulfilled in a larger sense by the Pieds Noirs by their drive to control the destiny of Algeria by partnering with rogue elements of the French armed forces to form the OAS and attempt to control France itself. As has been demonstrated above, neither the Pieds Noirs community nor its leaders had any interest in metropolitan France, and in fact believed it and its people to be beneath their notice. Their interest in the metropole was limited to manipulating the government and military to further their interests in Algeria. If it were necessary to govern Algeria in their own fashion by taking a share in ruling France, it was a nuisance they were prepared to take on. It was both a unique form and object of nationalism to suborn the metropole itself to rule the colony, but it seemed to the Pieds Noirs to be the only play they had. In most respects, Albert Camus was a typical Pied Noir, at least in early life. He was born in the Algerian town of Mondavi in poor circumstances to a French father and a Spanish mother. Many of his fictional works take place in Algeria, and one, The First Man, is a semi-autobiographical treatment of his childhood there. Additionally, he was a noted journalist who occasionally wrote and spoke about Algerian issues until his death in 1960. In The Plague, he describes the Pieds Noirs in Oran thus: perhaps the easiest way of making a town's acquaintance is to ascertain how the people in it work, how they love, and how they die. In our little town, is this, one wonders, an effect of the climate? All three are done on much the same lines, with the same feverish yet casual air. Their chief interest is in commerce, and their chief aim in life is, as they call it, doing business. The passions of the young are violent and short-lived. The vices of older men seldom range beyond an addiction to bowling, to banquets, and socials. Arabs and the Spanish feature prominently. The Spanish are typically exotic and garrulous, while the Arabs are usually silent watchers, with rare exceptions such as an Arab overseer and doula at the beginning of The First Man. As a young man, Camus belonged to the Algerian People's Party, a nationalist party that wished to include the Arabs, but as he grew older, he lost faith that the Arabs would not exploit their numeric advantage and become a devotee of a plan to retain Algeria in a French federation that would give both European and Muslim Algerians large voting blocs in the French Assembly, dismissive of the likely reaction to this idea by the metropolitan French. Alain de Sarigny, editor of the daily Le Show d'Alger, had a similar attitude toward the French. He seemed to believe that an order had been established in the May 13th uprising in which de Gaulle was in permanent debt to the Algerians for forcing the collapse of the Fourth Republic. When a Berber organization put forward a manifesto to unite all of the Berber tribes, Le Show d'Alger responded with a patronizing article reminding them that it had been decided in that 1958 event that their evolution could only occur within the context of l'Algérie française. When word of the negotiations at Evian leaked out, Sarigny helped to organize a riot in which he was arrested. Likewise, Pierre Lafont, editor of Les Show d'Oran, responded to the referendum in France approving Algerian self-rule by splashing a picture of General Salan, by then the leader of the OAS, on the full front page of that day's issue with the slogan, OAS vaincra, or the OAS will overcome. This paper makes use of Camus' novels and journalistic work, along with the writings and memoirs of Sarigny and Lafont, to provide a full picture of the state of Pied Noir nationalism leading up to their exodus from Algeria into France. It then tracks its progress through a quiescent period, picking up with the establishment of the Pied Noir Party in 1999, followed by the Pied Noir state. It looks at some of the darker aspects of this history, such as the assassination of Jacques Rousseau, leader of the Pied Noir group Record France, on March 5th, 1993, presumably by former OAS members suspecting him of treachery. Finally, it briefly compares the Pied Noir identity with the contemporaneous Révolution Tranquille in Quebec and the emergence of the radical group, the Quebec Liberation Front, in an effort to contextualize the events within the larger scope of French settler colonialism.